The cat appeared first. It came padding out of the snow-dusted pines at the edge of the trail like a small gray ghost, its fur the color of wood smoke, its paws leaving a chain of perfect prints in the fresh powder that had fallen overnight across the high mountain pass above the town. It stopped in the middle of the trail and turned to look at her with pale green eyes that held the calm certainty of a creature that knew exactly where it was going and had decided, for reasons entirely its own, that she should follow. If you are new here, welcome to Winter Whispers, and do consider subscribing. The cat held her gaze for 3 heartbeats and then turned and continued down the trail toward the dark rooftops visible in the valley below, its tail held high and slightly curved at the tip like a question mark posed to the cold morning air. Darcy followed. She had no particular reason not to. She had been walking since before dawn, descending from the high pass where she had spent the night, wrapped in her burgundy plum riding cloak beneath a shelf of overhanging granite, while the wind drove snow sideways through the darkness and the temperature dropped low enough to freeze the moisture in her breath into tiny crystals that settled on the wool like scattered diamonds. She had slept in fragments, waking every hour to the sound of ice cracking in the trees, pulling the cloak tighter and pressing her back against the rock wall, and waiting for the gray suggestion of dawn to appear at the eastern edge of the mountains. She was 21 years old, and she owned nothing beyond what she carried. The cloak with its brass clasps, a canvas rucksack containing a change of stockings, a tin cup, a folding knife, a pouch of dried venison, and $11 in mixed coin that represented everything she had earned in 3 months of work at a laundry in Denver. Her honey blonde hair was pulled back in a French braid that hung between her shoulder blades, and the braid had collected a fine dusting of snow that gave it the appearance of spun gold threaded with white silk. Her boots were good leather, but worn thin at the soles, and the cold of the frozen trail came up through them with each step, a steady reminder that winter at 9,000 feet in the Colorado mountains was not a season that tolerated hesitation. The cat led her down the switchback trail through stands of snow-laden pines whose branches drooped under the weight of the previous night's snowfall, bowing toward the ground in heavy white arcs that narrowed the path to barely the width of her shoulders. She ducked beneath the lowest branches, the snow from their needles showering down the back of her neck in cold powder that melted against her skin and ran in thin, icy lines beneath her collar. Past the pines, the trail wound between outcroppings of dark granite streaked with ice, where groundwater had seeped through cracks in the stone and frozen into translucent curtains that caught the thin morning light and scattered it in pale blue and silver fragments across the snow. The air was so cold it felt brittle, as though the atmosphere itself might crack if struck sharply, and her breath came out in white clouds that hung motionless in the still air for a long moment before dissolving into nothing. Below the tree line, the trail widened, and she could see the town more clearly. A single main street of perhaps 30 buildings strung along a frozen creek, their rooftops white with snow, their chimneys sending thin columns of smoke straight up into the windless morning air. It was a mining town. She could tell by the tailings piles visible on the hillside above it, and the skeletal frame of a stamp mill perched on the slope, its timbers dark against the snow. The creek that ran through the center of town was frozen solid, its surface a smooth white ribbon between banks of piled snow, and the buildings on either side of the street had the weathered, slightly tilted look of structures built quickly during a boom and settled into the slow lean of a bust. The cat walked directly to the main street and stopped in front of a building on the north side, midway down the block. It sat down in the snow beside the front step and looked back at Darcy with an expression that could only be described as expectant. She stopped and looked at the building. It was a single-story structure of rough-sawn pine planks with a false front rising above the roofline. A large front window, the glass still intact, was so thick with frost and grime that the interior was invisible, but through the haze she could detect the faintest suggestion of dark shapes within, forms arranged on surfaces she could not identify. Icicles hung from the eaves in a row of clear pointed daggers. A wooden sign hung from a wrought iron bracket above the door, its paint scoured by years of wind and snow to a ghost of legibility, but she could still make out the letters: E. Whitfield, Clockmaker, and Horologist. The padlock on the door had rusted into a solid lump of orange iron. She looked at the cat. The cat looked at the padlock. The hasp was attached to the doorframe by 2 screws that had rusted nearly through, and when she gripped it and pulled, it came away with a soft crunch and a small shower of rust flakes. The door swung inward on hinges that screamed once and then fell silent. Cold air rolled out of the dark interior, carrying a smell she had never encountered before. Metal and oil and dust and old wood and something faintly sweet and mechanical. The accumulated scent of decades of fine metalwork in a closed space where brass shavings had settled into floorboard cracks and watch oil had soaked into the wood of the workbench until the building itself smelled like the inside of a clock. The cat walked in ahead of her. She stepped through the doorway into the front room, and the morning light that followed her through the frost-hazed window illuminated a space that made her stop breathing. Clocks. The front room was filled with clocks. They covered every surface and occupied every shelf and hung from every available inch of wall space. And they were all silent, every one of them, their pendulums still, their hands frozen at whatever hour they had stopped, creating a room full of captured moments scattered across the face of time, like leaves blown from 100 different trees. Tall case clocks stood along the walls. Grandfather clocks with long pine cases and brass dial faces, their pendulum doors hanging open to reveal still weights and motionless pendulums within. Shelf clocks and mantel clocks crowded the display shelves along both side walls in rows 3 and 4 deep. Wooden cases of cherry and walnut and oak in every style and size. Some with painted glass panels in their doors depicting pastoral scenes and sailing ships and baskets of flowers in colors that had faded to soft pastels. Others plain and austere, with nothing but a round brass face and a pair of hands stopped at some arbitrary moment of some forgotten day. Wall clocks of every description hung from wooden pegs. Schoolhouse clocks with simple round faces and Roman numerals. Octagonal drop clocks with their pendulums visible through small glass windows. Banjo clocks with their distinctive elongated shapes tapering downward from the dial, their gilded cases catching what little light reached them and returning it in small, warm flashes. And on a long glass-topped display counter that ran across the middle of the room, dozens of pocket watches lay in rows on faded velvet trays, their cases open to reveal faces of white enamel and yellowed ivory, their hands pointing to hours and minutes that no longer mattered to anyone alive. Their delicate mechanisms visible through open casebacks where tiny gears and springs and balance wheels sat in the particular stillness of machinery that has simply run down, not broken, but waiting, holding its shape and its purpose in patient suspension until someone thought to wind it again. She walked slowly along the counter, her boots leaving prints in the thick, even layer of dust that covered the pine plank floor like a carpet of gray felt. The dust was perfectly undisturbed, and it lay on the glass countertop, and on the clock faces, and on the velvet watch trays, and on every horizontal surface, like a blanket that time had drawn over its own instruments, tucking them in for a sleep of indefinite duration. The gray cat jumped onto the counter and picked its way delicately between the watch trays, leaving small, round clearings in the dust where each paw fell. Behind the counter, a doorway covered with a heavy canvas curtain led to the back of the shop. She pushed the curtain aside, releasing a small cloud of dust that swirled in the gray light, and stepped through into the workshop. This was where the real work had been done, and she could feel it in the room the way you can feel the residue of concentration in a library or a chapel, a quality of focused attention that had soaked into the walls and the workbench and the tools over the course of decades and remained there still, like heat held in stone after the fire has gone out. A heavy wooden workbench ran the full length of the back wall, its surface scarred and stained and dented by decades of use. The wood worn smooth in the center where hands and arms had rested, and rougher at the edges where tools had been set down and picked up 10,000 times. On it lay the tools of the clockmaker's trade in such quantity and variety and state of organized readiness that she understood immediately she was looking at the accumulation of a lifetime devoted to a single craft. Rows of tiny screwdrivers arranged by size in a wooden rack, their handles worn to a polish by fingers that had gripped them so often the wood had molded itself to the shape of the clockmaker's hand. Sets of tweezers with tips so fine they could grip a single human hair. Magnifying loops on articulated brass arms clamped to the bench edge, their lenses still clear, their joints still holding whatever position they had last been set to. Files of every shape and cut hung from a pegboard on the wall above the bench, flat, round, half-round, triangular, needle-thin, each in its designated place marked with an outline drawn in pencil so that every tool could be returned to exactly where it belonged. Small brass hammers with heads no bigger than a thimble, spring-winding tools and mainspring clamps and gear-pulling devices that looked like miniature instruments of some precise and gentle science, jars of watch oil arranged by viscosity, tins of polishing compound, boxes of replacement crystals in graduated sizes, spools of fine brass wire. A jeweler's lathe the size of a bread loaf sat at one end of the bench, its chuck still holding a half-turned brass arbor, the small curls of brass shavings from the last cut still lying where they had fallen. Trays of clock parts sorted by type occupied a shelf above the work surface. Gears in one tray arranged by size from largest to smallest, springs coiled neatly in another, clock hands in another laid out in pairs, dial faces in another stacked like small plates, each labeled in a small, neat hand she would come to know well. A wooden stool sat tucked beneath the bench, its seat worn to a smooth concavity by years of sitting, the wood darkened and polished by the clockmaker's weight until it gleamed like saddle leather. On the bench directly before the stool sat a clock movement held upright in a brass repair stand, and the sight of it gave her a strange feeling in her chest, a feeling like walking into a room where a conversation had just been interrupted. The movement was partially disassembled, its back plate removed and set aside on a square of flannel, the gear train exposed, one gear lifted free from its pivot and placed on a separate square of felt beside a loop and a pair of fine tweezers, positioned with the deliberate care of someone who intended to return to this work in an hour, or after lunch, or first thing tomorrow morning. Whoever had been working on this clock had stopped mid-repair and never come back, leaving the mechanism open and waiting on the bench like a patient whose surgeon had stepped out and then simply never returned. She touched the exposed gear train. The brass was cold and faintly greasy with old oil, and when she pressed on the mainspring barrel, she felt the spring resist, still wound, still holding energy, waiting to release its force through the cascade of gears and escapements that would translate coiled steel into the measured passage of time. The gray cat sat on the bench beside the repair stand, watching her with pale green eyes. She noticed the cat seemed entirely at home, as though it had spent years in this room watching the clockmaker work with the same calm attentiveness it now directed at her. A narrow door at the back opened onto a storeroom. Inside, she found shelves stacked with clock cases in various states of completion. Raw wood blanks waiting to be shaped, their grain still rough from the sawmill, partially carved cases with their scrollwork roughed in, but their surfaces still showing chisel marks and pencil lines, and finished cases sanded to a smoothness that invited touching, ready for the varnish that would bring out the figure of the grain. Coils of clock chain hung from hooks on the wall like bronze necklaces. Bags of lead shot for casting clock weights sat in a neat row on the floor, each labeled with its weight in the same precise handwriting. Sheets of brass stock leaned against the far wall beside bundles of steel wire of various gauges and rolls of gut line used for weight cords. This was the supply room of a man who intended to keep working for years, who had laid in materials for projects he would never complete, and the abundance gave the room a feeling of interrupted ambition, of plans gathered for a future that had simply decided not to arrive. She returned to the workshop and noticed something she had missed. On the wall above the bench, partially hidden behind the pegboard, a small wooden door was set into the wall, perhaps 2 feet square, fitted flush with the planks so its edges were barely visible. The seams had been filled with beeswax matching the surrounding wood. A small brass catch held it closed. She turned the catch and the door swung open on silent hinges, revealing a cavity framed with cedar planks that still breathed faint resin. Within this hidden cabinet, arranged with the careful precision of objects considered precious beyond measure, sat a collection that made her draw a slow breath. Music boxes, 6 of them, each hand-carved from a different wood, cherry and walnut, and maple and rosewood, and 2 she did not recognize, one pale as bone and the other dark as chocolate. Each lid bore a different carved scene. The cherry box showed a mountain landscape with tiny pines beneath a crescent moon. The walnut depicted a stag in a forest clearing, antlers branching in intricate detail. The maple showed a covered bridge over a stream with trailing willows. The rosewood bore a woman's face in profile, every strand of wind-blown hair rendered individually. The pale box showed a clock face surrounded by stars. The dark box depicted cupped hands holding a small bird, the carving so precise she could see tendons beneath the skin and creases across the knuckles. She lifted the cherry box from its place and held it in both hands. It was heavier than she expected, solid and warm despite the cold of the room, as though the wood retained some memory of the living tree it had once been. She turned it over and found a small brass winding key set into the bottom. She wound it carefully, 3 turns, 4, 5, and set the box on the workbench and opened the lid. The mechanism inside began to play. The sound that emerged from the small wooden box was unlike anything she had ever heard from a music box. It was not the tinkling, slightly metallic sound she associated with music boxes, the bright, plinky notes of a child's ballerina box, or a jewelry case that played a simplified melody. This sound was rich and full and layered, with a depth and resonance that seemed impossible from so small an instrument, as though the box contained not a mechanical comb and cylinder, but a tiny orchestra playing in a tiny concert hall with perfect acoustics. The notes were warm and round and sustained, each one ringing clearly before fading into the next, and the melody they formed was slow and beautiful and entirely unfamiliar. Not a popular song or a hymn or a folk tune, but something original, composed specifically for this mechanism, a melody that rose and fell like breathing, like the slow swell and retreat of wind through mountain pines on a still winter afternoon when the snow is falling and the world has gone quiet. The gray cat closed its eyes. She wound and opened each box in turn, sitting on the worn stool with the cold pressing in from the walls and the gray light falling through the small window. Each played a different melody, each as beautiful and original as the first, each with that extraordinary richness of tone that spoke of a maker who understood sound the way a painter understands light. Not just the mechanics of its production, but the emotional quality of its resonance, the way a particular combination of notes played at a particular tempo on tuned steel teeth could bypass the thinking mind entirely and speak directly to whatever part of a person recognized beauty without needing to be told what beauty was. The 6 melodies filled the cold workshop one after another, and the dust motes turned slowly in the sound like snow falling through still air, and the gray cat sat on the workbench with its eyes closed and its paws folded beneath its chest, and the silent clocks in the front room stood in their dust and listened. She closed the last box and set it back. But behind where the music boxes had sat, pressed against the back wall of the cavity, she found something else, a leather-bound journal, thick as a Bible, its covers worn soft as cloth. She carried it to the workbench and opened it in the gray morning light. The first page bore a name in a precise draftsman's hand, Elias Whitfield, master horologist, and a date, 1857. The journal was a complete record of a clockmaker's life work spanning nearly 3 decades of practice in this small mountain shop, and it was written and illustrated with a precision and beauty that elevated it from a workshop ledger to something approaching art. Each entry described a project, a clock built, a mechanism designed, a repair completed, a commission fulfilled, and each was accompanied by technical drawings rendered with the exactness of a trained engineer and the aesthetic sensibility of an artist who could not bring himself to make anything ugly, even when no one would ever see it. Gear trains were drawn in perfect proportion, their tooth profiles calculated and noted in tiny marginal figures. Escapement designs were sketched from multiple angles with annotations explaining the theory behind each variation. Case designs were rendered in 3/4 perspective with dimensions and wood species and finishing techniques all recorded in that same small, precise, unhurried hand. She turned the pages slowly, carefully, aware she was handling something that represented not just the work of one man's hands, but the contents of one man's mind, laid out on paper with a completeness and honesty that made the journal feel less like a technical document and more like a form of confession. But it was the final section that stopped her. The last 40 pages were devoted to a single project, headed in letters larger and more carefully formed than any others. Designs for a perpetual motion clock. The drawings that followed were the most detailed and most beautiful in the entire journal, rendered with an intensity of focus that suggested the clockmaker understood these pages to be the culmination of everything he had learned and everything he believed about the nature of time and the possibility of capturing it. They depicted a clock mechanism of extraordinary complexity, a unified system of weights and counterweights, mainsprings and auxiliary springs, temperature-compensating pendulums and barometric pressure chambers, and what appeared to be a seismographic vibration harvester, all integrated into a single mechanism designed to run indefinitely without any form of external winding. The clockmaker understood, she could tell from his careful theoretical notes, that true perpetual motion was thermodynamically impossible. He referenced the relevant scientific principles with a familiarity that suggested years of serious self-directed study. But what he had designed was far more subtle and ingenious than a naive perpetual motion machine. It was a clock that harvested energy from its environment, from the temperature differential between day and night that caused a bimetallic coil to expand and contract and drive a tiny ratchet mechanism, from barometric pressure fluctuations that moved a sealed bellows connected to a pawl and spring system, from the subtle vibrations transmitted through the building by wind and the movements of the earth itself, captured by a weighted pendulum of specific length and mass, tuned to resonate with the natural frequencies of the building and the mountain beneath it. Each of these energy sources was captured by its own dedicated mechanism and fed through its own gear reduction into a central mainspring through a series of ratchets and one-way clutches that allowed energy to flow in only one direction, so that the clock was constantly and imperceptibly being wound by the ordinary processes of weather and season and planetary rotation, drawing power from the turning world the way a mill wheel draws power from a stream, never taking more than the world offered, never needing more than the world provided. Every component was specified down to its dimensions in thousandths of an inch. Every material was chosen for its specific properties of elasticity, or thermal expansion, or fatigue strength. Assembly sequences were laid out in carefully numbered steps. Testing procedures were described in exhaustive detail. Troubleshooting guides anticipated potential problems and offered solutions. The perpetual clock had never been built. The final entry in the journal, dated November of 1884, noted in a hand slightly less steady than the entries before it that the clockmaker had completed the designs to his satisfaction after 7 years of intermittent work, and calculated that the construction would require approximately 14 months of full-time effort. He wrote that he had acquired most of the necessary specialized materials: the custom-wound springs, the precision-ground gears, the temperature-sensitive bimetallic strips, the sealed barometric bellows, and stored them in the cabinet behind the pegboard. He intended to begin construction the following spring, when the days were longer and the light was better, and his hands were less troubled by the stiffness and aching that the mountain cold brought to his joints each winter with increasing severity. He believed the clock, once completed, would run for centuries. There was no entry after that. She sat on the worn stool and looked at the drawings and the calculations of a man who had spent 7 years designing a clock that would never stop, who had solved the problem with a brilliance she could recognize even knowing nothing of horology, and who had then run out of time before he could build it. The irony was not lost on her. She looked around the workshop at the tools and parts and the half-repaired movement still waiting on the bench. She looked at the music boxes in their hidden cabinet, each a small miracle of craftsmanship. She looked at the journal with its decades of drawings and its final 40 pages of blueprints. The greatest work of a man who understood that the purpose of a clock was not merely to measure time, but to assert that each second was worth counting, that the passage of hours and seasons deserved to be honored. She looked at the gray cat watching her with an expression she now understood as recognition. She closed the journal and held it against her chest. She went out through the front room and into the cold morning. The snow had stopped, and the sky had brightened to pale white gray, and the town lay quiet under its blanket of white. She walked down the main street until she found the land office, a desk in the back of the general store, staffed by a man in a wool vest drinking coffee and reading a week-old newspaper. She asked about the clockmaker's shop. The man set down his newspaper and his coffee and looked at her over the tops of his spectacles with the expression of someone deciding how much of the answer to share. He told her that Elias Whitfield had died 2 winters ago, that the clockmaker had been found one February morning by a neighbor who noticed the chimney had stopped smoking, sitting at his workbench with a clock movement before him and his tools laid out and his loop still on his head, as though he had simply stopped between one heartbeat and the next. No family that anyone knew of. The property had reverted to the county for unpaid taxes. Assessed value, $5, which was generous considering nobody in a mining town had much use for a shop full of stopped clocks. She counted $5 in coins onto his desk, one at a time, and he swept them into a cash box and wrote the deed on a pre-printed form and stamped it with the county seal and folded his newspaper and looked at her again over those spectacles and said he hoped she knew something about clocks. She said she did not, but she was willing to learn. He said that was probably the best answer she could have given. She walked back up the street to the shop. The gray cat was waiting on the front step exactly where she had first seen it, sitting upright in the snow with its tail curled around its paws and its pale green eyes tracking her approach. When she opened the door, it walked in ahead of her and jumped onto the workbench and sat down beside the repair stand with the half-disassembled clock movement, as though resuming a post it had only temporarily and reluctantly abandoned. She hung her burgundy plum riding cloak with its brass clasps on a peg beside the door, where another coat, the clockmaker's coat, had hung before someone took it away, and the peg received her cloak as though it had been waiting for exactly this wait. She rolled up the sleeves of her blouse and sat on the worn stool and picked up the tweezers and the loop and looked at the exposed gear train of the clock that Elias Whitfield had been repairing on the last day of his life. She would finish this repair first. She would study every page of the journal, master every tool on the bench, understand every mechanism in every silent clock in the front room. She would wind them one by one and listen to them come alive, each voice joining the chorus until the shop was filled with ticking, and the room frozen in silence for 2 years became a room full of recovered time. And when she had learned enough, when her hands were steady and her understanding deep, she would turn to the final 40 pages and build the perpetual motion clock, the thing Elias Whitfield had designed but never lived to construct, the clock that would run on the turning of the earth and the changing of the seasons and the pressure of the wind against the walls of this small shop in this quiet town in the high, cold mountains of Colorado. And it would never stop, and it would be his monument and her masterpiece, and the proof that some things, if designed with enough care and built with enough love, do not have to end. The gray cat purred, a sound like a tiny engine running steady and warm in its chest. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and unhurried, covering the main street and the frozen creek and the dark tailings piles and the rooftops of the quiet town with a fresh layer of white that erased all tracks and made the world look new. The smoke from the chimneys rose straight into the gray sky, and the pines on the mountainside stood dark and patient under their heavy cloaks of snow, and the morning light caught the ice on the creek and turned it to silver, and somewhere deep in the shop, a mainspring that had been holding its tension for 2 winters released one single tick into the silence, no louder than a fingernail tapping glass, as though the building itself had drawn a breath and whispered, "At last, welcome home." Subscribe to Winter Whispers for more quiet stories of forgotten places and the treasures hidden within them.